Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin Daf Nun Hey. We're going to start at the bottom. We had two situations. One was brought before Rabbi Ami. One was brought before Rabbi Avau about a Sefer Torah that was the person who sold it then claimed that there was a problem. The first one was there was a problem with the names of God that were written in it, that they weren't on the Shema. The second one was a problem with the parchment, that it wasn't on the Shema. In the first one, Rabbi Ami said, well, we believe you that you can lose your salary over it, so you don't get paid the money for it, but we don't believe you to mess up the buyer, because maybe there's a concern that maybe you're just lying to mess up the buyer. Whereas in the second case with Rabbi Avau, he said, because we believe you and you won't get your salary, obviously you wouldn't be lying if you're going to lose all your salary. So we're going to believe you when it comes to also disqualifying the Sefer Torah that's in this person's house, and we will believe you entirely. To which the Gemara asks, the top of our daf, Umay Shnami de Rabbi Ami. What's the difference between this and Rabbi Ami? Hatan ikalamemar taiba de Rabbi Yirmiyah. In that case, you could say that maybe the sofer who claimed, or the one who the scribe who sold it and then claimed that he messed it up. Maybe he thought like Rabbi Yirmiyah thought. If you remember in yesterday's stuff, Rabbi Yirmiyah had said that perhaps he doesn't lose all the salary because it's only the names of God. What about the rest of it? The rest of it was written fine, to which they said the Torah is worth nothing if the names of God are all messed up. So it's basically zero. But Rabbi Yirmiyah thought that it was worth something. So maybe the scribe also thought that. And maybe when he said it, he was willing to take a small loss of losing all the names of God in the Torah in order to mess up the buyer. And therefore, maybe he's not believed because there's a suspicion that he's lying. But here's going to lose it's clear to everyone. If he claims the parchment was bad, was not done properly, of course he's going to lose his entire salary, in which case, and he said it anyway, Imar kushta kamar, he must be telling the truth because there'd be no motivation for him to lie and lose his entire salary. So that's an possible explanation for the differences between the cases. Mishnah starts off, He'id Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada is going to testify about five different halachot. The last two are takanot, and that's why they're mentioned here. It's really like 4/5. You'll see one is kind of two parts. So the last two are here because of their takanot. The other two aren't takanot, but they're here anyway. They actually relate somewhat to at least marriage and divorce. Okay, here we go. The first testimony is about a chereshet. She si'avia, she yotze beget. If a blind, deaf mute, okay, this is someone who in halakha is considered not to have knowledge, not just deaf. Deaf people are considered to have knowledge, but we're talking about a deaf mute that her father marries her off, meaning she can't get married on a Torah level, but her father betroths her. That actually has validity on a Torah level, and therefore she can also have a get. Because why? Normally you'd say, well, if the father married her and then she's in charge, but she doesn't have dad, so how could he possibly divorce her? But if you remember, we discussed that you could get divorced against your wishes, right? Even if you don't want to get divorced. It means that her dad is not important in the divorce, and that's why he can divorce her. A minor who's a daughter of an Israelite, and she marries a Kohen. Now here Rashi says we're talking about where her marriage was only on a rabbinic level because she was an orphan, her father was dead, her mother or brother married her off. It's the case we learned a long time ago. She could do miyun, she could just say, I don't want to be married to this person anymore. So because it's only a rabbinic level marriage, if she marries a Kohen, she can actually eat truma. Rashi says we're only talking about truma on a rabbinic level. Okay, but there's a bit of a debate about that. V'im meta, this is the kind of extra case here, ba'ala yorsha. If she dies, her husband can actually inherit her. Even again, by Torah law, it's not really a marriage, but he gets to inherit her. Va'al maresh hagazul shebena'o babira shitolatama b'pnei takanat hashavim. This is a very famous takana. If you steal a beam and then you build it, and it's now in the middle of a huge building, and if we want, in general, you have to return your lost item. If we're going to make your stolen item, if we're going to make you return the stolen item, you're going to have to break down the entire building. You're never going to do that. So you have no motivation to admit that you stole it, and the person who got robbed is never going to get their item back. So according to this takana, it's called takanat hashavim, to cause people to repent. We basically say you can just pay the amount that you owe. We're going to understand this one way, although in the Gemara we're going to suggest another alternative reading. If you have an animal that you bought, you have an animal that you stole and you want to use it for a sin offering, you bring it to the temple and the Kohen offers it on the temple, and nobody really knows that it's stolen. It's not known to the public. It atones for you, even though it's stolen, even though generally we say mitzvah haba ba'avera is not, right? We don't do a mitzvah by sinning. And in fact, the classic example they use there is a stolen sacrifice, which is interesting. It comes up in the sugya in Sukkah. This is because we're worried about the altar. Okay, what exactly we're worried about, we're going to get to in the Gemara. And as I said, we're going to have 2 readings about what exactly the takana is. Amar Rava. So the Gemara starts off with the first halach. Amar Rava. Meuduto shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada amar le'edin. From what Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada said, we can infer the following. Amar le'edin. If one says to witnesses, Ru'u get zeh shani noten la. Go look, I'm about to give her a get. Be my witnesses. And then he says to her, goes to give her the get, but instead of saying, here's your get, he says, here's a promissory note for you. Take it. She's divorced, because what did Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada say? Even if she doesn't understand what she's getting, it doesn't matter. So she has no idea she's getting a get. Obviously, she'll open it and she'll see a few minutes later. But at the moment she gets the divorce, the document, she's immediately divorced, even though she thinks it's a promissory note. Milo Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada, here comes the proof. Did he not say, Lo b'ina data? We don't need her knowledge, her understanding. Hachanami, lo b'ina data. So likewise here, we don't need her to understand what's going on. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, obviously, she got a get. Of course she's divorced. Well, they say, Mao, you might have thought, Tevanda Amar kinsi shtarchov zeh bitule batle. You might have thought that when he says, take this promissory note, maybe he's canceling the get, right? We saw those cases in the 4th chapter of husbands who don't want to give the get and they cancel it. Maybe he really wanted to just cancel the get. So he said to the Adim here, I'm going to give this get to my wife, but then he changes his mind. So when he gives it to her, he says, here's a promissory note, basically saying this isn't a get. I'm not really giving you the get. Well, kamashmalan, therefore he comes to teach you, no, we don't say that. Because in ita debatle, le'edim havar lehu. If he really wanted to cancel the get, he would have told the witnesses. Right here, he said to the witnesses, I'm giving her a get, and then he didn't tell them anything after that. So then why did he say, now we have to try to get into his mind. Why on earth did he say such a thing? This is a promissory note. Well, mishum kisufa, he was embarrassed. He's embarrassed to say to her, I'm divorcing you. He'd rather just, right, some people don't like to speak the truth and kind of face up to their issues. He just wants to say, here's a promissory note, and then she'll open it when she's at home and see it and see it's the divorce. He just didn't want to get involved in a conversation with her. He's embarrassed about it, the whole thing. Again, this is another good case of just trying to get into the head of what is a person thinking when they do something strange like this. So now we're going to talk about this minor who gets to eat truma. Now, what we're really going to point out is, notice they gave the example of a ketana, not a chereshet. They were already in the chereshet, so why didn't they speak about the deaf mute? My time. So why doesn't she get to eat? Because if her father married her, let's say, then she would get to eat. You would think, because she's married on a Torah level. Well, if a deaf person marries another deaf person, a deaf mute and a deaf mute, then it's only a marriage on a rabbinic level. And if he's a Kohen, she won't be able to eat truma. So they wanted to tell you that a chayreshet can't eat, or they inferred it from the Mishnah. The fact that the Mishnah didn't say so, because she can't eat, because if she's married to a deaf person, we're worried she'll think that she can eat and she really can't. So even if she's not married to a deaf person, she really could eat truma. We don't allow it because of this concern. To which the Gemara says a very interesting thing. Velecho, why are we so concerned? In other words, you're going to make a gzera on a woman who can eat truma, not to eat truma, just in case this woman who can't eat truma will accidentally eat truma. But why is it such a big deal? Very interesting logic here. It's like a child who eats non-kosher food. There's no punishment. It's not a transgression. This woman who's a deaf mute doesn't understand, so she doesn't get punished for things. So why would, now it's not saying we should go encourage her to do this, but the point is, why would we make a gzeira on a woman who can eat truma, so that just in case a woman who can't eat truma eats it, when the woman who can't eat truma in the end, nothing happens to her if she eats it. She's not responsible for her actions. So the answer, fine, that's not really the reason for the gzera. It's a gzera shema ya'apil cheresh b'pikacha. If a deaf male is married, Kohen, is married to a female who's not deaf, then it's not a marriage on a Torah level. She can't eat truma. But if you allow the deaf woman who's married to a man who's a pikach, you might think that the deaf whose father married her off, you might think that the deaf man who's married to the pikachat, the non-deaf woman, is going to be allowed to eat truma. And that's the reason why they forbade her from eating truma. To which they asked for at least it should allow her to eat truma that's on a rabbinic level. Well, gzera shema'atelo, and that is the cheresh pikachat, for example, she should be able to eat truma d'Rabbanan. To which they answer no. Gzera shema'atelo truma d'oraita. We don't let her eat truma that's on a rabbinic level, because she might end up eating truma on a doraita level. What, by the way, is truma on a rabbinic level? So by Torah law, many people hold that you only have to bring on dagan, tirosh, and yitzhar, on wheat, right, grains, not just wheat, but all the grains, the wine, and the olives, and olive oil. But anything else is only rabbinic. So maybe she could eat that? No, because we're worried then she'll eat truma doraita. Now we're going to talk very briefly about this takanat shavim in order to encourage robbers to return their items. And now we're going to bring a bright and see that this whole thing is actually machloket beit Shammai beit Hillel. If you stole this beam and you built it in this big building, beit Shammai you have to take about the entire thing. This is very beit Shammai-like, right? You stole something, Torah says you have to return it. You have to return it. No, just the value because of this takanat shavim, right? Mipnei takanat shavim. Now we're going to have two different interpretations, Ula and Rav Yehuda. Then the Gemara is going to bring two questions from the language of the Mishnah. Doesn't seem to match Rav Yehuda's explanation, but they'll answer it. And then one question on Ula. And then from the question on Ula, we're going to get off onto a side question, and that's going to be the end of this section. So ala chatat gzula, and then we'll get to a new Mishnah. Amar Ula, Tvar Torah, ben noda, ben lo noda, ena mechaperet. Ula says, on a Torah level, and this is always, right, there's a takana, and there's what was by Torah law. By Torah law, whether you know it was stolen, whether you don't know it was stolen, ena mechaperet. This does not atone for you. My timer. What's the reason? Yeush k'di lo kane. Yeush, what's Yeush? Okay, Yeush is, I told you a while ago about my car that was stolen. Now, when your car is stolen at a certain point, right, depends when, but, I was lucky. Within an hour, they found my car, and within 2.5 hours, I had my car back in my house. But usually, that's not the way it happens. Usually, the car gets stolen, and the first few hours, you try to think, hopefully, I could get it back. Or if you wake up in the morning and your car is gone, you figure it's a done deal, right? I'm sure my car is in parts already, and they've sold the parts, and I'm not getting anything. And then it's called giving up. That's called Yeush. At a certain point, you give up and you say, I'm never going to see this car again. Then you call the insurance company and you get yourself, you figure out how to get a new car. But basically, that's called Yeush. Now, the question is, when I have Yeush, does that turn, now this is a fascinating concept in Halakha, we'll talk about this a lot in Bava Kama, does that turn the robber into the owner? Because I've given up on my ownership of it. So did they acquire it in some way? Now, they've done a kinyan because they've done mashicha, they've pulled it. Now, it's not like I gave them rights to it. And that's the crazy part. But we're going to see that the machloket and Ula and Rav Yehuda, and understand this mission, depends on whether you think that Yeush is kone or not. The fact that I give up on it, does that mean that the robber has acquired it? So Ula says, no way, no how. So if the robber has not acquired it, they certainly can't bring it as a sacrifice. It doesn't make a difference whether people know about it or don't know about it. So now why does the takana come in? If it's not known that it's stolen, why does that atone? We don't want the kohanim to get upset. Now we're talking about a chatat offering. A chatat offering is a sin offering. What happens to a sin offering? A few parts get burnt on the altar, and the rest is given to the kohanim to eat. So Rashi says, if the kohanim end up eating this stolen item, right, and it didn't atone either, they're going to be very upset. They're going to say, oh my God, we brought this sacrifice. Now we're eating it. We're benefiting from this stolen item. And it didn't even atone for this person on the altar. And they'll be very unhappy. Now, why do we care that they're unhappy? So we're going to see soon that once they're unhappy, they're not going to want to bring sacrifices anymore. Now, whether it means just for that day, for a few hours, or whether it means in general, they might start thinking, oh, if I brought this one that was stolen, how do I know that someone else didn't steal their animals? And, the Kohanim are basically put in this situation where they're bringing other people's sacrifices and they might be bringing stolen items. So if it's not known, they'll have no, right? And then they find out, they'll say, oh, wow, I don't want to really do this. This is a dangerous job. I end up eating sacrifices that should never have been brought in the first place. It's not allowed, right? You can't really eat a sacrifice that wasn't meant to be there. And right, of course, it's not their fault, but it doesn't matter. They'll be very upset about it. So they say, but that doesn't match the language of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says because of the altar, not because of the Kohanim. So he said to them, no, eventually, right, the Kohanim being upset will affect the altar because they'll stop bringing sacrifices. And then the altar won't have sacrifices going. That's an embarrassment, right? If you remember, we learned Ishkalim that they would, and in other places also, they would try to have sacrifices going all the time. People will stop wanting to bring these sacrifices, right? The Kohanim won't want to be doing it, and in the end, it will affect the altar. So that's the first explanation. That again, by Torah law, really, none of these atone because Yehush is lo kohen. So the robber really didn't own it, right? And it's only the tikkun olam, so the Kohanim don't end up eating this meat and getting all upset about it, saying, I'm not going to bring sacrifices anymore. Rav Yehuda Amar, Dvar Torah, by Torah law, he says, Bein noda, bein lo noda, mechaperet. Doesn't matter whether they knew or not, it actually does work. Why? My time, Yehush kadi kane. Yehush does make you acquire it. Okay? If I have Yehush, I give up on my car. The thief, believe it or not, according to Rav Yehuda, is the owner of my car now. Okay? To a certain extent. Okay, it's not a full owner. But that means he's an owner to the extent that if he sanctifies it, it's sanctified. Umatam amru, again, this whole concept of the thief owning something, we're going to deal with this much more. This is just brought up here within the sugya. I'm not going to spend too much time in it, but we will get there much more in Bava Kama. Umatam amru nod'a ena mechaper. By the way, we talked about this also in Lulav Gazul. We talked about stolen things. Umatam amru nod'a ena mechaper. So now we have to understand the gzera according to this. So the gzera is to say this doesn't work. We don't want people to, once it's known to the public, we can't let this go on, even though theoretically he really is the owner, because people are going to say, what an embarrassment, the altar is eating stolen items. So now we're going to say the following. We're going to have two questions of Rav Yehuda. Number one, Ula makes a lot of sense. I know the katane chatat, because the chatat was something the Kohanim ate the meat of. If the whole problem is bringing things that are stolen on the altar, what's the difference if it's an ola or it's a chatat? Either one. To which they say lo mebaya. Lo mebaya means it's the structure of, we're not going to give you the more simple one, we're going to give you the one that's a little more complicated. Lo mebaya, but yes, it would obviously also include the ola. Lo mebaya ola, the kalil. Of course, the ola, which entirely gets burned, we're not going to allow, because people are going to say, look at that altar, it's burning, right? It's burning a whole animal that is stolen. But even the chatat, only the fats and the blood goes on the altar. And the rest the Kohanim eat. We still don't want people to say that the Mizbeach eats stolen items, even if it's only small things like just the blood and just the fat. So that's the chidush of the Mishnah, that even a chatat, according to Rav Yehuda. But now we have a bigger question on Rav Yehuda. Tana, it says in the Mishnah, it says, what's the tikkun olam according to this? That the chatat that's stolen that nobody knows about atones because of the takana. That sounds exactly like ula. It should have said a sacrifice that is known to Rabim should not go on the altar because it looks like the altar is eating nevela, right? Because of takanat mizbech. So they say, that's really how to read it, which is, lo noda mechaperet. If it's not known, it will atone. Noda, but if it is known, ena mechaperet, then it doesn't atone. Mipnei tikkun mizbech, because of the takanat of the mizbech. So it's as if it says it. This is the same problem we had last time with the pigul and the kohanim shogegim mizidim. Mativ ula. Mativ Rav. Rav is going to now bring a question on Ula. So we resolved the two questions on Yehuda from the language of our Mishnah. Now we're going to bring another source, which is a contradiction to Ula. Ganav v'hikdish v'achar kach tabachu machal. If someone stole and then sanctified their stolen item, and then slaughtered and sold, they pay the double payment, but they don't pay the 4 or 5 payment. 4 or 5 payment is for someone who stole and then sold or slaughtered and sold, or slaughtered or sold. Now, why do they not pay the 4 or 5? Because in between the time they stole it and sold it or slaughtered it, they actually sanctified it, which means it doesn't belong to them. Now, Tane Allah, they said a braita about this, which said about on this source, B'chutz, this is a Mishnah in Baba Kama, B'chutz ki agavna anush karet. If they then slaughtered it. If the slaughtering was done outside the temple, which once they sanctified, it has to be done inside the temple, this person's going to get karet, death penalty of karet for doing what we call shchutei chutz. We're not allowed to slaughter sacrifices outside the temple. Now, iyamart, Yeush kdilo kanin. If you're going to be Ula and say Yeush doesn't work to acquire it for the robber, karet ma'avidite. How can you get karet for taking this sanctified item? Here and really, there's a bit of a question because this question isn't really on the Braita on the Mishnah. The question is really on the Mishnah itself. Why, in general, is when he sanctifies it, shouldn't be sanctified? I can't sanctify your item. Doesn't do anything. I have to sanctify only something that's mine. So how could Ula think, if Ula says Yesh lo koneh, how does this Mishnah make any sense? Okay, now they ask really not on the Mishnah, on the Braita. People ask that question and say, why didn't you really ask it on the Mishnah itself? Because again, the Mishnah itself already said that it works to exempt him from the 4 or 5 payment. But let's just leave that question aside. The main thing here that the Gemara is saying is, how could you possibly get karet as if you did something forbidden by Torah law when you didn't even own it, which means you didn't even sanctify it? So it doesn't make any sense. So what are they going to say? I'm Rav Shizbi, karet mi divrei. Rav Shizbi says it's karet on a rabbinic level, to which the rabbis said, what a joke. Achiku alei. They laughed at him. They said, what a ridiculous thing to say. Karet mi divrei mi ikad. Have you ever heard of karet on a rabbinic level? There is no such thing. Karet is a Torah mandated punishment. It's not something, and it's God. God is punishing you. The rabbis don't say you get karet for something the Torah didn't say you get karet for. So now they said, what a ridiculous thing to say, and they made fun of him. Amar lehu Rava. Rava said to the rabbis, Gavra Rabba Amar Milta, lo techuku alei, lo techuku alei. This important person said something, don't laugh at him. Okay, first of all, often you have to be very careful. It's good criticism for people. Don't laugh at something until you understand what they're saying. You obviously misunderstood what he was talking about. He doesn't think there's karet on a rabbinic level. It's karet that he's going to get now because of what the rabbis instituted. And what does that mean? The rabbis said, now, according to Ula, Yehush Lokom, so those guys who stole my car, they don't own it. But what? If they sanctified it to the temple and then used it for non-sacred things, let's say, okay, it's not an animal, but let's say it was an animal they stole, and then they brought it as a sacrifice. Now, the rabbi said, in order, right, if you then take it, you steal it, you take it, use it for a sacrifice, and then you slaughter it outside the temple, so you sanctified something and now slaughtered it outside the temple. So in order, the rabbi said, you know what? For purposes of punishment, that is in your hands. And because it's your sanctification work in order to make you liable for this shchutei chutz, for slaughtering it outside. So again, it's a karet because you slaughtered it outside, but it comes from a rabbinic decree that the rabbi said, we're considering it in your hands that you're liable for damages, basically, or you're liable for, right? We don't want to make you're not going to get away with murder here, right? And take it, sanctify it, then do it outside, and what, you'll be exempt because it's not in your property. I'm a Rav. So now that was the question on Ula, and we resolved the question. So the questions on Rabbi Yehuda were from our Mishnah. The question on Ula was from a different Mishnah and a Braita about that Mishnah. Now Rava says, though, right, Rava brought this question, Ula answered it, or they answered it for Ula. Amarava havadai kamibaile. But he says, this I really am going to have a question about, which is, when the rabbi said this is going to go into your possession, mishat geneva or mishat tekdesha? Did they put it in your hands from the time you stole it or from the time you sanctified it? What's the relevance? Well, amay nafkamina. What's the relevance? The gizotea uvladotea. That means if from the time I stole it, it then grew more wool, right? Or it had offspring. So the question is, when I return that item to you, do I have to return it including the offspring or the time, what it was at the time of the theft? So now they say the following. If you say from Geneva, it's yours, okay? It's going to be you stole it. From the time you stole it, it's yours. Then all the extra stuff belongs to you, because at that moment you have to return basically the item the way it was when you stole it. Before, right, when it was owned by the other person. If now it's worth more, you gain that because you gained it from the time of the theft. So that means the gain goes to you. But if you say from the time of the haftasha, then anything that happened before that it was still in the other person's domain. So you have to return it to them. Okay, so what's the answer? Hadran Mistaber Mishatek Desha. He says it seems to me like it would be from the time of Hekdesh. Why? Because otherwise they're going to get rewarded. I stole your item, it now had offspring, and I only have to return to you without the offspring, so now I gained? That seems ridiculous. So therefore, it seems more likely that we're going to punish me more and basically take that away from me. New Mishnah. Let's start explaining a bunch of things here. First of all, Harugei Milchama, Rashi says, means during the time of the destruction of the temple. And that's where we're going to get to all these famous stories today, starting today, and moving on the next bunch of pages about the Churban, the destruction, like Kamsa Bar Kamsa. We're almost there. So now, there weren't Sikarikon in Yehuda in the time of Harugei Milchama. Now, Sikarikon are Gentile murderers, basically, or maybe not necessarily murderers. Okay, Rashi says specifically we're talking about, it's a goy rotzeach, it's a Gentile murders. Shenotema Yisrael karka b'pidyon nafsho. Basically, they put a gun to your head and say, give me your land or I will kill you. And they really will kill you. So we're going to see later, it doesn't really make so clear what do you mean they weren't Sikarikon. Clearly, there must have been Sikarikon when they were killing us in war. So what this is going to mean later, they're going to say is the law of Sikarikon, which we're going to learn in a minute, was not applicable during the time of the destruction. But when things changed after the destruction, then, okay, we're going to see later that they weren't really going to kill us as much anymore at that point. Yesh ba Sikarikon, the laws of Sikarikon apply. What are these laws of Sikarikon? Ketzad. Lakach mi Sikarikon, v'chazar v'lakach mi balabay. Let's say they stole my land. Okay, they put a gun to my head, made me give them the land, I gave them the land. Then you bought the land from them. And then, when you bought the land from them, you knew that it was my land, so you went to me and you bought the land from me also. So, lakach mi Sikarikon, v'chazar v'lakach mi balabay, and then you come get it from me. Mikcho batel. When I come later and say, this is my land, and you say, but you sold it to me, and say, it doesn't matter. First of all, you bought it from the Sikarikon. I never really gave it to him. And you bought it from me, but I only said that because I thought the Sikarikon wanted to make sure the deal went through. He wanted to get his money because they usually purchased, just like they stole my car to sell the parts, they stole land in order to sell it to other people. So the Sikarikon basically sold it to you to make money. And basically you came to me to make sure that you said to the Sikarikon, listen, I'm not going to put the sale through until I get confirmation from Michelle that she's okay with this. And if I would have said no, the Sikarikon would have come after me again. So I just lied. Like, I didn't mean, number one, to give it to the Sikarikon. And I didn't have Yeush yet. That's what we're going to get to, the same thing of Yeush before. I really haven't given up on getting the land back. And when I said, yes, you can buy it off me, I didn't really mean it. I was only saying it so the Sikarikon would come get me. But mi balabayit, the chazar v'lakach mi Sikarikon, but at first you went to me before you went to the Sikarikon, and I told you could buy it off me. And then you went to the Sikarikon because it wasn't really in my possession anyway, and you bought it off the Sikarikon. Then we don't say that I was scared of the Sikarikon and I lied. No, I wasn't scared because you hadn't even gone to them yet. And then the sale is a good sale and I can't change my mind. So likewise, lakach minaish. Let's say a woman brings property into her marriage. The husband has rights to use it while they're married, but then he has to give it back at the end. Now he sells rights to this land to somebody else. Now he can't do that without me because it's my land. So lakach min ha'ish, somebody buys it from him. And then he goes to the wife and says, is it okay? Will you sell it to me? And she says, yes. Again, she didn't mean it. She's only doing it because she's scared of her husband. And she, he's going to get very angry at her. So he says, sure. She says, sure, you can have it. But it was never the husband's rights to sell it. And when she agreed, she didn't really mean it. So it doesn't, she can say, I never meant to sell that to you. But if he went to me first and asked me to buy it, and then went to my husband, that is a good sale. Now they tell you about the Sikari Kon, that there was a bit of history here. And the Mishnah is going to now describe, Zo Mishnah Rishona, this was the original, the Beit Din after them said no. Things changed at a certain point. What was the problem? The problem was nobody wanted to buy from the Sikari Kon. Because if you buy from the Sikari Kon, you're not going to get your land back anyway. So why would I do it? So now you had all this Jewish land that was stuck in the hands of the Sikari Kon. And obviously the people who it was stolen from didn't have the money to pay for it. Other people did, but they would get it taken away from them anyway. So there was no motivation to buy the land. And we wanted to return Jewish land to Jewish owners. So they said the following: someone who buys from the Sikari Kon can keep the land and just has to give the owner a quarter of it. The assumption is that anyway, the Sikari Kon drops the price of the land and sells it for a bit of a cheaper price. And that way you're getting anyway what you paid for, and you give a quarter to the original owners. Okay. So as a buyer, you're not really losing out because anyway, you're getting the land for less money than it would have been worth anyway. Matai, when does this work though? Bisman she'en bi'adam likach. This is only if the people whose land it was don't have money to pay for it. Aval, yesh bi'adam likach, ein kodmim l'chol adam. But obviously you have first dibs if you did this. Rebbe Hoshiv Beit Din Novanimnu. But Rebbe sat his court down and decided something else. She'im sha'ata b'fnei Sikari Kon 12 chodesh, kol hakodem likach zachat. Aval noten lebalim revi. Rebbe sat down his Beit Din and they made a decision that if they waited for the Sikari Kon, in other words, if it was in his possession for 12 months already, then anyone can get it. And again, they still have to give a quarter back. If you're not the original owner, you have to give a quarter back to the original owner. So now the Gemara starts up and says the following: Hashda b'harugei milchama lo haya b'sikari kon, meharugei milchama ve'elach yesh b'sikari kon. The simple reading sounded like there were no sikari kon during the time of the destruction. Only after that there were. But it doesn't make any sense. Things were worse during the time of the destruction when they were in war. So Amar Rav Yehuda lo danu ba'din sikari kon kamar. What it meant is they didn't rule the law of sikari kon. Now why? Because what? Because if someone puts a gun to your head and says, give me your land, and it's time of war, you know you're never getting that land back. In that case, you really intended to give it to him because you wanted to save your life. So for that, we're basically going to assume you really did sell it, and you had yeyush, and you never intended to get it back, and therefore it's really a good sale. And therefore people could buy from the Sikari Kon, it was their own. The Amar Rabbi Asi, as Rabbi Asi said, now we're going to talk about the different stages. Shalosh gzerot kasvu. The first, there were 3 ordinances instituted by it. There were 3 different types of rule at different times. First, gzerata kamiyata, the first one, anyone who doesn't kill a Jew will get killed themselves. So there, it was really bad for the Jews. Mitziata, in the middle period, anyone who killed either would get paid for zuzim, which is not a lot of money, so they would get a little reward. It wasn't like you were going to get killed if you didn't do it, but get a little bit of reward. Some people say it means you have to pay a penalty of 4 zuzim, which again, not such a big deal for killing a person. So people still killed Jews, but not so much. But the last time period, called the katil liktaluhu. Anyone who kills actually would get killed. And then there was real judgment, and basically it wasn't a free-for-all, and Gentiles didn't kill us all the time because they knew they would be brought to judgment. So therefore, what does that have to do with Sikari Kon? Hilka, Kamaito Mitziata, in the first time period, in the middle time period, Kevan de Katle, since they killed us all the time, or were easy to kill us, Agav Unse Gamaru Makne, because you thought you were going to get killed, you basically were forced into it, but you said, take it, and assumed you were never going to get it back again. But the later time period, Amre Ha'ina Lishko. So someone goes and puts a gun to your head and says, give me your land. Not really going to kill you. But, or maybe they didn't even put a gun to your head, but they scared you. So you give it to him, but you figure tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, I'll go to court and I'll get my land back. So you never really intended to, you didn't think, it's not like my car got stolen. Here I knew who took my land. So I said, tomorrow I'll go bring him to court. And therefore, the mekach is batel because he doesn't really own it. Now we're going to get sidetracked. My dictiv, ashrei adam mefached tabid. Happy is the person who's scared. Okay, we're going to see in a minute what that means. Someone who's heart of heart will fall into bad things. Okay, Rashi says, what does it mean? Mifached. He worries about the future, about what's going to be. Now, why did they get to this? Because the sikari come, right? Someone puts a gun to my head, I'm worried what's going to be, and I act upon it. So now they're saying people who don't worry about what's going to be and think about planning their actions could bring terrible things. And from here we'll get to Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Kamsa Bar Kamsa Chalev Yerushalayim, because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, this famous story, Jerusalem was destroyed. A Tarnagol v'Tarnagolata, because of a rooster and a hen, Chalev Tul Malka. The mountain of the king was destroyed. Ashaka derispak, because of the door of a chariot of a woman, Chalev Beitar. Beitar was destroyed. You're going to see what these stories are. Start with Kamsa Bar Kamsa. We'll just get started with this today, and then we'll get to all these stories. These are, by the way, the Gemaras that you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av, because they're all about the destruction. Right? Normally we don't learn on Tisha B'Av, but specifically these Dapim we can. Kamsa Bar Kamsa Chalev Yerushalayim. Dahu Gavra. Derach me Kamsa Ubal Devave Bar. Sorry, I didn't read that well. Hey Gavra Derach me Kamsa. His best friend was Kamsa. Ubal Devave, his best enemy, his biggest enemy was Bar Kamsa. Anyway, this person, we don't have his name, Avid Sudat, he made a meal. Amrle, the Shami, said to a Shamash, Zil Aitele Kamsa, go invite Kamsa. It was this very big meal, as we might remember from the story. And he says, go invite Kamsa, my best friend. Azal Aitele Bar Kamsa. But the Shamash wasn't the smartest person, I guess, or he didn't realize, he didn't know what was going on. He, by accident, invited Bar Kamsa. So Ata Eshkachay Davayatu, so the owner of this meal, right, this person, sees Bar Kamsa sitting at his meal. He says his big party, Amrle, Michdiahu Gavra, Debava, you're my biggest enemy, Dahu Gavra, you're the biggest enemy of this guy, meaning of myself. My Baitachi, what on earth are you doing here? Kum Puk, go leave my party. Amrle, Ho Il Va'atai, Shavkan, he says, listen, I'm already here, just leave me be. But Yavina Le Dame, my Dachil Shatina, and I'll pay you the money for what I ate and drank. Okay, and with this, we end in the middle of the story, and wait till tomorrow if you don't know the story to see what happens. So now, just a quick review. We started with the two stories, Rabbi Ami and the Rabbi Yad. Do we believe someone when they said the Torah is pasul? Do we believe him only to lose his salary, or also to really disqualify the Sefer Torah when it's in someone else's hands in it? Then we had these testimonies of Rabbi Yochanan and Gud Gida about the Chereshet, that her father betrothed her, that she gets to leave with a get because you don't need your knowledge of the get. And we got from there the story of the guy who gives the get and says promissory note. Then we moved on to the Ketana, Bat Yisrael, the minor, who marries a Kohen who can eat Truma, but then we said the Chereshet, who can't eat Truma. And why is that? Because of the Gzera. And then we had the Maresh. We had a Machloka B'Chama B'Hil, Hill, whether you have to actually break down the whole building to return the stolen item, or you could just return the value. From there, we got to the Takana on the Mizbeach of the Chatat that was stolen, and we had two ways of understanding it, Rabbi Yehuda and Ula, and then from there we got into questions on each of them. And then we ended with this Mishnah on the Sikari Khan, and from there we got to trying to think about what the ramifications of actions are, and if we had, maybe Jerusalem wouldn't have been destroyed. And with that, finish today's daf, and we will. And by the way, within all that, we got into this big machlok about is Yeush Koner or not, and even the Sikari Khan, we got into these things about, did you really mean to pass on rights to it, or did you not, and how we deal with stolen property. With that, we'll finish for today. Have a great day, everyone.